So last week we focused on average rate of change, and we found it from tables, and this is from our penny stacking activity, and we found it from graphs. And we found it using intervals. So we were given x values and we had to find y values. So now you're just going to watch the screen for just a little review before we go and take notes today. So we have our formula. I'm highlighting it, so you're watching that, for average rate of change or slope. We need 2 y values and 2 x values. So the first thing that we have to look for are our x values, and that's our interval. So here our interval is our data between where x is 5 and x is 15. Well, if we have two x's, and we could say the first one is x1 and the second one is x2, we need y values that correspond with those. So I'm going to go over to my table, and I'm going to find where x is 5. So here we go. I'm going to go over to my table, and x is 5 right here. And if I look next to x, I find that the y value for basically that ordered pair is 4. And then I look at my x2 value, or find my x2 value, which is 15. And then the corresponding y value is 16. Now that I have those two ordered pairs, I'm going to take those and I'm going to fill out my formula for average rate of change. So I'm going to put my y values on top and my x values on the bottom, just following the formula up above. I'm going to solve my top numbers first, my bottom numbers. I'm going to divide those and get my final answer. Okay, so that was our step. Our steps. So we have an interval. We need a y value for each of those x values in our interval to plug into the formula. So now we're going to learn how to do that when we are given an equation. So we did a table, intervals from tables, intervals from graphs, and now we're going to do intervals, an average rate of change from an equation. So you are going to take notes on page, let's see where we're at, page 13 in your notes. You're going to go to example 3, so you can pause this for a second so you can find that in your notes. And then we'll get started. All right, now we're back, and we're going to look at using an equation. And to do that, we're going to use what we know about tables as well. And we're going to go back to the idea of input. We do something with that x value, put it into the equation, and then we get our output. So, just looking for my calculator here. All right, I'm going to pause this video. All right, so I got it organized. Here we go. So we are going to be given an equation, and we are going to find the average rate of change. So you will need to follow along now, and if you need to pause the video to catch up, you just need to ask to do so. We're going to remember that we're finding average rate of change, and the formula for that is m equals y1 minus y2 over x1 minus x2. So if you think it'll be helpful to write that down at the top, go ahead and do that. Sometimes it helps, especially to make sure that you put the y values on the top and don't accidentally put the x values and get everything switched around. Okay, so let's get started with A, and we have the equation f of x equals x squared plus 4, and then we have our interval, so we have x1 to x5. So I'm going to just blow this up a little bit bigger, and we're going to write it in interval notation first. So we're going to do our brackets, 1 comma 5, and our first value is our x1 and our second value is our x2. Now we talked, or I mentioned earlier, that we're going to use a table to find our y values. So let's do we'll do x, and then we're going to write our equation, because x is our input and then our equation is our rule. We did the function machine earlier in the trimester. And when we get our answer and we solve it, we put our x values in for x, and then whatever, when we solve it, that n value is a y. I won't always make you write it in this format, but you will create a table each time. So we have our two x values, so we don't need any other numbers but those two numbers. So my first value is 1 and my second value is 5. I'll go ahead and put a line in between there so we can just visually kind of see things. I'll give you a second to create your table on your paper, and then we'll do some solving. So go ahead and pause the video. Okay, so 1 and 5, 1 is our x1, 5 is our x2 value, and we're going to input them into the equation. So I'm going to change colors here. You might want to do that too. So in place of x, I'm going to put a 1 in parentheses. That x is squared, so I'm going to square it and then do plus 4. And I'm going to do that same thing with the 5. It's also the input, so I input it in for x. So 5 squared plus 4. Now you're going to put both of those, each of those, into your calculator. And when you get the answer, you're going to put it over in that final column. So go ahead and pause the video and input that into your calculator. And I'm going to just scroll down so you can see, I don't want you to see the answer, but I'll give you a second to put it in your calculator. So when you put in the first value, it should look like this on your calculator. So if you look at the board, the 1 is in parentheses, you have the square on it, and then plus 4, and your answer is 5. So 5 is our output, or our y value, and that'll be y1. So take that, go back up, and put in a 5, and I am going to label that y1. We're going to do the same thing. Now I am going to remind you that you can, once you have that equation in your calculator, so if you look at the board, once you have that equation in your calculator, if you hit your second button, which is the blue button, and you hit the enter button, which is enter is also considered your equal button, then what will happen is it'll pop that equation. I'll make it black. It'll pop that equation back on your screen, so it will pop up with 1 squared plus 4, and then you can use your back arrow, your back cursor, to go back here and then put in your 5. So if you look at the board, if you use second enter, you'll be able to replace that number in the parentheses, go back and just type over it, and then hit enter again, and you get your final answer. So our last bit of input, our x2 is 5, and our output is 29. So you should have gotten 29. So 29. And that is going to be our y2 value. Now from here, once we have that, we want to find our average rate of change, and we have our equation up top. If you look at the board, I'll highlight it. So we're going to just plug in our y values, where our y1 is 5. We're going to subtract our y2 value, 29, from that, and then put our x values, that's 1, x1, so 1, minus our x2 value, I'll put an m there, is 5. Right, so we put our y values in up top, and then we put our x values in at the bottom, and then we're going to solve the top first, get an answer, and then solve the bottom. So 5 take away 29 is negative 24, and then 1 take away 5 is negative 4, and when we divide that out, that a little bit, oops, let's move that over a little. And when we divide that out, 24, negative 24 divided by negative 4, we get a positive 6. So our average rate of change is 6 in that interval, or that chunk of data that we're looking at. Okay, let's try another. I'll give you a second to catch up, so you can pause that if people need to make sure your answers match mine. All right, we're going to go over to B. Now, this equation is in factored form. Our equation over here was in standard form, and then this equation is in factored form. Same process, we're just going to plug in our x value into our equation in both those x positions. Now look at the board. One thing I want to remind you is f of x is also another way of saying y. So that's really a y. So when we plug in our x values, our answer is y. I'm going to make you create a table again, big enough that we can put both of those parentheses in our table. Our interval only has so your table should look like that. Again, our input is x. Our roll, or what we're going to do to our numbers, comes from that equation. So we're going to put the equation in here. And then our output is our y value. All right. You need to ask for that to be paused. And then I'm going to continue. Our interval is where x, between x is negative 4 and x is 2. Our interval notation then is negative 4, comma 2. That's x1, x2. So those are our input values. So we're going to go over to our table and put in negative 4 and 2. And the first value is x1, the second is x2. We get our answers. We have y1 and y2. And then we're going to go plug those into our equation. Use a different color. So in place of x, I'm going to put -4 and then +3. And in this row, both of those x's are going to be -4. And then I'm going to plug in the next row, both x's will be 2. So 2 + 3. And then 2 - 1. And you're going to put that into your calculator just like you wrote it. So in parentheses, -4 + 3, close your parentheses, next parentheses, -4. Remember, it's the negative button outside of the 4, and then it's subtract 1, and then close your parentheses and get your answer. All right, so I got 5 for my y1 value. And let's see if I hit the blue button, and enter. My parentheses pop up again, and I can use the delete button and go over top, or you can just retype it. So if you use the delete button, it's DEL. It's up by the cursor at the top. And you can delete the 4, and then just use your back cursor to go over the negative sign and put in the 2. If that doesn't work, just start fresh, plug it all in. And once we have that, we hit enter, and it looks like we had 5 again. Okay, so our output is the same. So we're going to go ahead and plug it in. So we have m equals, our y1 value is 5, minus our y2 value, which is also 5, all over -4 minus 2. Okay, plug that into your calculator. And you actually should get 0 over -6. And then anything, 0 divided by anything is just 0. So our average rate of change is 0. And normally we might find that towards the, remember we talked about towards the top of our parabola or the bottom of the parabola where things slow down. And we just have this 0 rate of change where we just almost pause for a second. Not going faster or slower, it's kind of a flat line. All right, by now you should be getting the hang of things. It's just really plugging in numbers. You just have to be careful that you're plugging your numbers in carefully. So I want you to try, I'll help you set this one up and then give you some time. You can pause it and take it to the end and check your answer. So let's do our table first. Our input column, a little wider at the top for our equation, x and y. And then we're going to put our equation at the top, x squared plus 4x minus 1. Just be careful and pay attention to those x's and the fact that the first one is squared. We have our interval, x equals 1 and x equals 4. So 1 comma 4, oh, that's a bracket, x1, x2, and then we're going to plug that into our table, 1 and 4. And remember that when we put that 1 in the parentheses, it's squared, plus 4, and then we're going to put in parentheses that 1 again, and then minus 1. And then we do the bottom, 4 goes in the parentheses again, and that's squared. And then we have 4 times the 4 that's our input, minus 1. And then you're going to go ahead and solve that. So we've got, let's see. So our output for 1, looks like I've got a 4, and when 4 is our input, 31 is our output. And then I'm going to label y1, x1, x2, y1, y2, plug it into my equation. And then 4 minus 31. And 1 minus 4. Oops. Make sure you're using your subtract and not your negative sign, -3. And then when we divide that out, we get a positive 9. And that is our average rate of change. So the biggest thing you want to remember here is that your input goes in both your x positions in the same row. So make sure you're squaring things and putting things in parentheses. Let's see, I'll help you set up the next one also. So you can pause this and leave it on the screen if you need to just double check your work. And then we'll move on to setting up the next one. The biggest thing on this one really is that you have a negative outside your x. So x, y. So you have this negative x squared plus 7x plus 12. Oh, that's going to bug me. So that's what you're going to have to pay attention to when you put it in your calculator. I'll just put the inputs. I'm just going to do it really quick. So when you go to put this in, you can put a -1 out front of those parentheses. Blow this up a little bigger so I can fit everything. And then in the parentheses, 0 squared plus 7, 0 is our input, plus 12. And then again, that negative out front stands for a -1, so we're going to go -1. Our input is 5 for the x, plus 7, and I squared that. And then again, in for x is 5, and then plus 12. Scooch that over a little. All right, and then you can plug that into your calculator. But again, that's a negative sign out front, so you have to put that -1 in there and get your input and your output. So you can pause this, do some work, and you can double check it in just a second. Negative x squared plus 7x plus 12 and 0. Our output is 12 when it's 0 and 22. All right, and then plug that into your equation, get your answer, and then we'll talk about your assignment for the day. Okay, so I'm going to just point out a couple things. Again, our interval our x values we got from right here. I kind of went quickly. And so we didn't do our interval notation, and so that would be 0, 5. And then our x1 value and our x2 value. And we can come down into our table and just label those x1, x2, y1, y2. So not a bad idea to label those. It just makes it easier when you go to plug them in to make sure that you're kind of on the right track, not grabbing the wrong numbers. And then we're going to go in and do our equation. Our y's go on the top. And we just kind of work our way down the table from this side. So y1 goes first. So it's 12 minus 22 over 5, again, working our way down the table. 0 minus 5, and then we do that, we get negative 10 over negative 5. And again, you need to put those in your calculator if you're not that great with positive and negative numbers to make sure you get the signs correct. If you wanted to put it in your calculator all at one time, well, let's not have you do that. Simplify it and then do negative 10 divided by negative 5, and you should get 2. So our average rate of change for the interval of 0 to 5 is 2. All right, you hopefully got those correct. And we have 4 different types of equations. They're all quadratics, just working with a different focus. So in this one, again, we set up our table. We were missing our b value. If you notice, there were only 2 terms to start out that quadratic, but we could just plug it into our table. We had another one that was in factored form, and we just made sure that we took our input and put in both places for our x values. We had just a typical standard form, 3 terms. Again, making sure that in each row our input for x remained the same, 1 and 1, and then a 4 and 4. And then we had another quadratic in standard form. This one had a negative 1 out front, so when we put it in our table, we need to make sure that we included that in our equation. All right, let's talk about your assignment. So your assignment is going to be homework 7, average rate of change. And at this point, you should have done or be doing and completing 4, 5, and 6. Truthfully, you should be able to do 7, 8, and 9 because it's really just pulling numbers from a table. You don't have to create one, it's created for you. So you just find your interval. So if you look at the screen, you can see that. You go to your table where x is 1 and x is 4. And each time I do want you to write your interval notation. So 1, 4, and then label those x1 and x2. Oops. x2. So label those and then go on and show your work and show your formula. If you have a word problem, answer your, make sure you put in, explain your answer using words. It would be something per something, time and temperature. And then 10 and 11, you're actually going to do, so 10 and 11 is exactly what we just covered. So from an equation, so you have to make a table. You have to make your own table for each of these and include your equation. So just like we did in the notes, so if you have to flip back and forth between your notes, do that. So make sure you have your x and your y value and then your equation at the top. Okay, just like we did. And then you can take, and then it has you interpreting it. So you could see what you think about an answer, try to answer the B on those, but we didn't really talk about that right now. So really, you're doing homework 7, and you're completing 1 through 11 at this point. So go ahead and get after it.